If you don't do this, you are headed for trouble. Back in 1898, a tragic event occurred in Rockland County, New York. A child had passed away, and the neighbors were preparing to attend the funeral. On that same day, Jim Farley went out to the barn to hitch up his horse. The ground was blanketed with snow, the air was crisp and biting, and the horse, which had not been exercised for days, was full of pent-up energy. As Jim led the horse to the watering trough, it playfully reared and kicked both its hind legs high into the air, tragically killing Jim Farley. Thus, the small village of Stony Point witnessed 2 funerals that week instead of 1. Jim Farley left behind a widow, 3 young boys, and only a few $100s in insurance. His oldest son, also named Jim, was just 10 years old at the time. Faced with the harsh realities of life, young Jim went to work in a brickyard. There, he wheeled sand, poured it into molds, and turned the bricks on their edges to dry under the sun. Unfortunately, Jim never had the opportunity to receive much formal education. However, his natural geniality allowed him to develop a knack for making people like him, and this talent would serve him well in life. As he grew older, Jim entered the world of politics, where his remarkable ability to remember people's names became one of his. Despite never setting foot inside a high school, Jim Farley's accomplishments were nothing short of remarkable. By the age of 46, he had been honored with degrees from 4 different colleges and had ascended to the positions of chairman of the Democratic National Committee and Postmaster General of the United States. During an interview, I once asked Jim Farley about the secret of his success. His response? Hard work. I smiled and said, "Don't be funny." He then turned the question back on me, asking what I thought was the reason for his achievements. I replied, "I understand you can call 10,000 people by their first names." "No," he corrected me with a grin. Farley's ability to remember names was not just a quirky talent. It played a critical role in helping Franklin D. Roosevelt win the presidency in 1932. Before Farley's rise to national prominence, he honed his skills during his time as a salesman for a gypsum company and as the town clerk of Stony Point. Over the years, he developed a method for remembering names that started simply. Whenever he met someone new, he would gather as much information as possible about the person's full name, family background, occupation, and political views. He would mentally record all of this information, and the next time he encountered that individual, even if it was years later, he would be able to recall their name, inquire about their family, and perhaps ask about their backyard garden. It was no wonder that Jim Farley became such a beloved figure. Months before Roosevelt's presidential campaign began, Jim Farley personally wrote hundreds of letters each day to individuals across the western and northwestern states. Then, over the span of just 19 days, he traveled 12,000 miles through 20 states by buggy, train, car, and boat. In each town he visited, Farley would meet with locals over breakfast, lunch, tea, or dinner, giving them heartfelt one-on-one talks. Afterward, he would hurry on to the next stop. Upon returning to the East Coast, Farley would follow up by writing to someone in each town he had visited, requesting a list of all the people he had met. This practice culminated in a massive list containing thousands of names, and each person on that list received a personal letter from Jim Farley. These letters always began with a warm salutation like "Dear Bill" or "Dear Jane," and were signed simply Jim. Farley's knack for remembering names was no accident. He had discovered early in life that most people find their own name to be the most pleasant and significant sound in any language. Calling someone by name is a powerful way to show respect and build rapport. Conversely, forgetting or misspelling someone's name can have the opposite effect, creating distance or resentment. I experienced this firsthand when I organized a public speaking course in Paris, and sent form letters to American residents. Unfortunately, the French typists who filled in the names made numerous errors. One particularly upset recipient, the manager of a prominent American bank in Paris, sent me a scathing letter, furious that his name had been misspelled. Remembering names is not always easy, especially when the name is unfamiliar or difficult to pronounce. Many people avoid the effort by using a nickname or shortening a name, but this approach can rob interactions of their personal touch. Sid Levy, a salesman, recounted his experience visiting a customer named Nicodemus Papadoulos. While most people simply called him Nick, Levy made a point of repeating the full name to himself several times before making his sales call. When Levy greeted him with, "Good afternoon, Mr. Nicodemus Papadoulos," the customer was visibly moved. "In all the 15 years I've been in this country," he said, tears welling up in his eyes, "no one has ever made the effort to call me by my real name." This same principle of using names was key to Andrew Carnegie's success. Known as the Steel King, Carnegie admitted to having only a limited understanding of steel manufacturing. Instead, his fortune was built on his leadership skills and ability to manage people. Early in his life, Carnegie learned the value of personalizing interactions by remembering and using names. One example of this comes from his childhood in Scotland. After acquiring a mother rabbit, Carnegie quickly found himself with a whole litter of bunnies, but no food for them. He hit upon an idea. He promised the neighborhood children that if they brought enough clover and dandelions to feed his rabbits, he would name each of the baby bunnies in their honor. The plan worked flawlessly, and it left a lasting impression on Carnegie. Years later, when Carnegie was looking to sell steel rails to the Pennsylvania Railroad, he applied the same psychology. J. Edgar Thompson was the president of the railroad at the time, so Carnegie built a steel mill in Pittsburgh and named it the Edgar Thompson Steel Works. The strategy paid off. When the railroad needed steel, it naturally purchased it from Carnegie's mill. Carnegie's keen understanding of the power of names also extended to his rivalry with George Pullman, a fellow industrialist in the railroad sleeping car business. The two men were engaged in fierce competition, cutting prices to unsustainable levels. One evening, Carnegie and Pullman met by chance in New York, and Carnegie suggested they merge their companies instead of continuing their mutually destructive battle. Pullman was intrigued but hesitant. He asked Carnegie what the new company would be called, and Carnegie immediately replied, "The Pullman Palace Car Company." The name appealed to Pullman's ego, and the merger went through, creating a pivotal moment in industrial history. Carnegie's ability to remember names and use them to forge connections was a cornerstone of his leadership. He took pride in knowing the names of many of his factory workers and often boasted that no strike ever disrupted his steel mills while he was in charge. The significance of remembering names was also understood by Benton Love, the chairman of Texas Commerce Bank Shares. Love believed that as corporations grow larger, they tend to become impersonal. He saw remembering names as a way to counteract this coldness. An executive who says he can't remember names is admitting that he doesn't remember a significant part of his business, Love remarked. The magic of names is not confined to the corporate world. Karen Kursak, a flight attendant for TWA, made it a habit to learn and use the names of as many passengers as possible during her flights. This small gesture often left passengers feeling valued and personally cared for. One customer even wrote to the airline saying, "You make me feel that your airline has become very personalized, and that matters to me." People often go to great lengths to preserve their names for posterity. P.T. Barnum, one of the most famous showmen of his era, was so disappointed that he had no sons to carry on his family name that he offered his grandson $25,000 if he would adopt the name Barnum Seeley. Similarly, many wealthy patrons throughout history have supported artists, musicians, and writers in exchange for having their names memorialized in dedications. Today, libraries, museums, and universities are filled with buildings and collections that bear the names of their benefactors. From the New York Public Library's Astor and Lenox collections to the stained glass windows in churches, people strive to ensure that their names are remembered. Yet, despite the importance of names, many people struggle to remember them. Often, they claim to be too busy to make the effort, but even someone as occupied as Franklin D. Roosevelt found the time. Roosevelt was known for his ability to recall the names of everyone he met, including the mechanics who worked on his specially adapted car. W.F. Chamberlain, one of the mechanics who delivered the car to the White House, described his encounter with Roosevelt in a letter. Chamberlain taught the president how to operate the car, which had numerous unusual features designed for someone with paralyzed legs. During their meeting, Roosevelt not only called Chamberlain by name, but also took the time to notice and compliment the craftsmanship of the car, from the radiator to the custom suitcases in the trunk. Roosevelt even made a point to thank the shy mechanic who had accompanied Chamberlain, remembering his name and shaking his hand. Roosevelt understood that remembering names was one of the simplest yet most effective ways to build goodwill. Unfortunately, many of us fail to practice this skill. We meet someone, exchange pleasantries, and then promptly forget their name by the time the conversation ends. In politics, business, and social interactions, the ability to recall names can make all the difference. Napoleon III, the Emperor of France, was famous for his memory. Despite his many royal duties, he made a point of remembering the names of everyone he met. His method was straightforward. If he didn't catch a name, he would ask for it to be repeated or spelled out. During the conversation, he would repeat the name several times and try to associate it with the person's appearance. If the person was particularly important, Napoleon would write the name down afterward, fix it in his mind, and then tear up the paper. He believed that good manners were built on such petty sacrifices. The power of names is not reserved for royalty or corporate leaders. It can benefit anyone. Ken Nottingham, an employee at General Motors in Indiana, had a memorable experience with a cafeteria worker who always seemed to have a scowl on her face. One day, Ken noticed the woman's name tag. He smiled and said, "Hello, Eunice," when ordering his sandwich. Her response was immediate. She piled on extra ham, lettuce, and chips, completely forgetting the scale she usually used to measure portions. Names are powerful. They set individuals apart and make them unique. Whether dealing with a waitress or a senior executive, using someone's name imbues the interaction with a personal touch. The information we impart or the requests we make become more meaningful when we address someone by name. Principle 3. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. An easy way to become a good conversationalist. Some time ago, I attended a bridge party. I don't play bridge, and there was a woman there who didn't play bridge either. She had discovered that I had once been Lowell Thomas's manager before he went on the radio, and that I had traveled in Europe a great deal while helping him prepare the illustrated travel talks he was delivering at that time. She said, "Oh, Mr. Carnegie, I do want you to tell me about all the wonderful places you have visited and the sights you have seen." As we sat down on the sofa, she mentioned that she and her husband had recently returned from a trip to Africa. "Africa!" I exclaimed. "How interesting! I've always wanted to see Africa, but I never got there except for a 24-hour stay once in Algiers. Tell me, did you visit the big game country?" She said yes, and I responded, "How fortunate! I envy you. Do tell me about Africa." This led her to talk for 45 minutes. She never once asked me where I had been or what I had seen. She didn't care to hear about my travels. All she wanted was an interested listener to expand her ego and talk about her own experiences. Was this unusual? Not at all. Many people behave this way. For example, I once met a distinguished botanist at a dinner party hosted by a New York book publisher. I had never spoken to a botanist before, and I found the conversation fascinating. I sat on the edge of my seat, captivated as he spoke about exotic plants, experiments in developing new forms of plant life, and indoor gardens. He even shared some astonishing facts about the humble potato. I had a small indoor garden myself, and he was kind enough to offer advice on how to solve some of my gardening problems. As we were at a dinner party with about a dozen other guests, I violated all the rules of courtesy by ignoring everyone else and spending hours talking to this botanist. Midnight came, and after saying goodnight to everyone, I left. The botanist then turned to our host and paid me several compliments, saying I was most stimulating and a most interesting conversationalist. This puzzled me. How could I have been an interesting conversationalist when I had hardly said anything? The truth is, I hadn't spoken much at all. I couldn't have contributed without changing the subject, as I knew nothing about botany. What I had done was listen intently, genuinely interested in what he was saying. And he felt that interest, which naturally pleased him. Listening in this way is one of the highest compliments we can pay to others. As Jack Woodford wrote in Strangers in Love, few human beings are proof against the implied flattery of rapt attention. I went even further than simply giving him my attention. I was hearty in my approbation and lavish in my praise. I told him that I had been immensely entertained and instructed, and I had been. I told him I wished I had his knowledge, and I truly did. I expressed my desire to wander the fields with him and learn more, and I meant it. I even told him I must see him again, and I did. As a result, he walked away thinking of me as a great conversationalist. But in reality, I had merely been a good listener, encouraging him to talk. What is the secret to a successful business interview? According to former Harvard President Charles W. Eliot, there is no mystery about successful business intercourse. Exclusive attention to the person who is speaking to you is very important. Nothing else is so flattering as that. Eliot was a master of the art of listening. Henry James, one of America's early great novelists, described Eliot's listening style. Doctor? Eliot's listening was not mere silence, but a form of activity. Sitting erect, with his hands joined in his lap, he made no movements except to revolve his thumbs around each other, facing his interlocutor, and seeming to hear with his eyes as well as his ears. He listened with his mind, attentively considering what you had to say. At the end of an interview, those who spoke to him felt they had truly been heard. This is self-evident, isn't it? You don't need a Harvard education to figure it out. Yet, there are department store owners who rent expensive space, buy goods economically, dress their windows appealingly, spend thousands on advertising, only to hire clerks who don't know how to be good listeners. These clerks interrupt customers, contradict them, and irritate them, driving them away. A department store in Chicago almost lost a regular customer who spent thousands of dollars annually due to a sales clerk's refusal to listen. Mrs. Henrietta Douglas, a student in one of our courses, had bought a coat during a special sale. After bringing it home, she noticed a tear in the lining. She returned the next day, asking for an exchange, but the sales clerk refused even to listen to her complaint. "You bought this at a special sale," the clerk snapped, pointing to a sign on the wall. "Read that. All sales are final. Once you bought it, you have to keep it. Sew the lining up yourself." Mrs. Douglas explained that the coat had been damaged when purchased, but the clerk interrupted, insisting that final is final. Outraged, Mrs. Douglas was about to walk out and vow never to return when she was approached by the department manager, who recognized her as a longtime customer. Mrs. Douglas recounted the situation, and the manager listened attentively, examined the coat, and offered to repair or replace the lining, or refund her money. What a difference in treatment! If that manager hadn't listened, the store would have lost a loyal customer. Listening is just as important in home life as in business. Millie Esposito, a mother from Croton-on-Hudson, New York, made a habit of listening carefully whenever her children wanted to speak to her. One evening, after a brief discussion with her son Robert, he said, "Mom, I know you love me very much." She was touched and asked, "Of course I love you. Why would you doubt it?" Robert replied, "I don't doubt it, but I really know because whenever I want to talk to you, you stop whatever you're doing and listen." Even the most critical people can be subdued by a patient, sympathetic listener. The New York Telephone Company once dealt with a customer who was notorious for his complaints. This man refused to pay certain charges, cursed at customer service representatives, wrote letters to the newspapers, and filed complaints with the Public Service Commission. Eventually, a skilled troubleshooter was sent to deal with him. The troubleshooter listened attentively, allowing the customer to vent his anger. He didn't argue or interrupt. After several visits, during which the troubleshooter simply listened and sympathized, the customer began to soften. On the fourth visit, the matter was settled, and the customer paid his bills in full, even withdrawing his complaints. What this man had wanted wasn't justice. He craved a sense of importance. Once he felt heard, his grievances melted away. Years ago, a customer stormed into the office of Julian F. Detmer, founder of the Detmer Woolen Company, furious about a small debt. He declared that he wouldn't pay the bill and would never buy from Detmer's company again. Detmer listened patiently, letting the customer speak his mind. When the customer had finished, Detmer thanked him for bringing the issue to his attention and assured him the charge would be erased. Surprised by this response, the customer's anger dissipated, and he ended up placing an even larger order than before. He remained a loyal customer for over 2 decades. Another example comes from the life of Edward Bok, a poor Dutch immigrant who later became one of the most successful magazine editors in American history. Bok started his career as an office boy at Western Union, but he educated himself by writing to famous figures like General Garfield, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Louisa May Alcott. He listened to their stories, asked thoughtful questions, and built relationships that shaped his life. Isaac F. Marcusson, a journalist who interviewed hundreds of celebrities, observed that many people fail to make a favorable impression because they don't listen attentively. They are so focused on what they want to say next that they don't truly hear the other person. Even Abraham Lincoln, during the darkest days of the Civil War, called upon a trusted friend to come to Washington. Lincoln talked for hours about his plans to free the slaves, but never asked for his friend's opinion. He simply needed a sympathetic listener to help him clarify his thoughts. One of the greatest listeners of modern times was Sigmund Freud. A man who met Freud was struck by his concentrated attention. Freud listened so intently that the man felt truly understood, even when he expressed himself poorly. If you want to alienate people, ignore them, interrupt them, and talk only about yourself. But if you want to be a good conversationalist, be an attentive listener. Ask questions that others will enjoy answering, and encourage them to talk about themselves. Remember, people are far more interested in their own problems than in yours. A person's toothache matters more to them than a famine on the other side of the world. Principle 4. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. How to interest people. Anyone who has ever been a guest of Theodore Roosevelt was amazed by the scope and variety of his knowledge. Whether his guest was a cowboy, a rough rider, a New York politician, or a diplomat, Roosevelt always seemed to know what to talk about. How did he manage to do this? The answer is simple. Whenever Roosevelt expected a guest, he would stay up late the night before. reading up on topics that interested his visitor. Roosevelt understood, as all leaders do, that the best way to connect with someone is to talk about what they care most about. The genial William Lyon Phelps, essayist and professor of literature at Yale, learned this lesson early in his life. When I was 8 years old, I was spending a weekend visiting my Aunt Libby Lindsley at her home in Stratford on the Housatonic, he wrote in his essay on human nature. A middle-aged man called one evening, and after some polite conversation with my aunt, he turned his attention to me. At that time, I happened to be very excited about boats, and the visitor spoke about the subject in a way that seemed particularly interesting to me. After he left, I mentioned to my aunt how wonderful the man was. My aunt informed me that he was a New York lawyer and that he didn't care at all about boats. He had no interest whatsoever in the topic. But why then? Did he talk all the time about boats? I asked. She replied, "Because he is a gentleman. He saw that you were interested in boats, so he talked about the things he knew would interest and please you. He made himself agreeable." Phelps concluded, "I never forgot my aunt's remark." While writing this chapter, I have a letter from Edward L. Chalif, a man active in Boy Scout work. "One day, I found myself needing a favor," Mr. Chalif wrote. "There was a big Scout jamboree coming up in Europe, and I wanted the president of one of America's largest corporations to pay the expenses for one of my boys to attend the trip. Just before going to see him, I heard that this man had written a check for $1 million, and after it was canceled, he had framed it. So, the first thing I did when I entered his office was ask if I could see the check. A check for $1 million. I told him that I had never known anyone who had written such a check, and that I wanted to tell my boys I had seen one. He was delighted to show it to me, and I admired it. I asked him to explain how it came to be written. Notice that Mr. Chalif did not start by talking about the Boy Scouts, the jamboree in Europe, or the favor he wanted. Instead, he spoke in terms of what interested the other man. The result? The businessman eventually asked, "By the way, what was it you wanted to talk to me about?" Mr. Chalif told him, and to his great surprise, the businessman not only agreed to fund one boy's trip, but also 5 boys and Mr. Chalif himself. He gave them a letter of credit for $1,000 and urged them to stay in Europe for 7 weeks. He even met them in Paris and showed them around. Since then, this man has given jobs to some of the boys whose families were in need, and he remains active in their group. Chalif concluded, "Had I not found out what interested him and warmed him up first, I doubt I would have found him so approachable." 5. Is this technique valuable in business? Let's look at an example. Henry G. Duvernoy of Duvernoy & Sons, a wholesale baking firm in New York, had spent 4 years trying to sell bread to a certain New York hotel. He had called on the manager every week for 4 years, attended the same social events, and even lived in the hotel to get their business. But he failed. Then, after studying human relations, Mr. Duvernoy decided to change his approach. He learned that the hotel manager belonged to a society of hotel executives called the Hotel Greeters of America. Not only was the manager a member, but his enthusiasm had made him president of both the organization and the International Greeters. The next time Duvernoy saw him, he struck up a conversation about the Greeters. What a response! The manager talked for half an hour about the Greeters, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. Clearly, the organization was not just a hobby. It was his passion. Duvernoy said nothing about bread during that conversation. A few days later, the steward of the hotel called Duvernoy to request samples and prices. "I don't know what you did," the steward said, "but he sure is sold on you now." Reflecting on this, Mr. Duvernoy realized that after years of trying to get the manager's business, it was only when he finally took the time to understand the man's true interests that the breakthrough occurred. A similar story comes from Edward E. Harriman of Hagerstown, Maryland. After completing his military service, Harriman wanted to settle in the beautiful Cumberland Valley, but jobs were scarce. Research revealed that many companies in the area were controlled by an enigmatic businessman, R.J. Funkhauser, whose rise from poverty to riches fascinated Harriman. However, Funkhauser was known for being difficult to approach. Harriman studied his interests and learned that Funkhauser's drive for power and money defined him. He also focused on Funkhauser's dedicated secretary, who had been his right hand for 15 years. When Harriman approached her with a proposal that emphasized how it could bring financial and political success to Funkhauser, she became interested. She arranged a meeting between Harriman and Funkhauser. Harriman walked into the impressive office without asking directly for a job. Funkhauser thundered, "How about it, young man?" Harriman replied, "I believe I can make money for you." Funkhauser stood, invited him to sit, and the two discussed Harriman's ideas. Funkhauser hired him on the spot. For over 20 years, Harriman thrived under Funkhauser's mentorship, and both prospered. The lesson is clear. Talking in terms of the other person's interests benefits everyone involved. Howard Z. Herzig, a leader in employee communications, has always followed this principle. When asked what reward he gained from it, Mr. Herzig said that each person gave him a different reward. But generally, the greatest benefit was that each conversation enriched his life. Principle 5. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. How to make people like you. Instantly. I was waiting in line to register a letter at the post office on 33rd Street and 8th Avenue in New York. While waiting, I noticed the clerk appeared bored with the monotonous tasks of weighing envelopes, handing out stamps, making change, and issuing receipts. The same routine year after year. So I thought to myself, I am going to try to make that clerk like me. Obviously, to make him like me, I need to say something nice, but not about myself, about him instead. I then asked myself, what is there about him that I can honestly admire? Sometimes this can be a difficult question to answer, especially with strangers. But in this case, the answer came easily. I immediately noticed something about him that I truly admired. So, while he was weighing my envelope, I remarked enthusiastically, "I certainly wish I had your head of hair." The clerk looked up, half surprised, but his face soon broke into a beaming smile. "Well, it isn't as good as it used to be," he replied modestly. I assured him that, although it might have lost some of its youthful glory, it was still magnificent. He was clearly pleased. We exchanged a few more pleasant words, and the last thing he said to me before I left was, "Many people have admired my hair. I can imagine that person went to lunch that day walking on air. I'll bet he went home that night and told his wife about the compliment. I'll bet he looked in the mirror and said, 'It really is a beautiful head of hair.'" I once shared this story in public, and after I finished, a man asked me, "What were you trying to get out of him?" What was I trying to get out of him? If we are so contemptibly selfish that we can't spread a little happiness or offer honest appreciation without expecting something in return, we are bound to meet the failure we deserve. Yes, I did want something from that man, but it was something priceless. I wanted the feeling of having done something for him without expecting anything in return. That feeling, the joy of making someone else happy, stays with you long after the moment has passed. There is one all-important law of human conduct. Always make the other person feel important. John Dewey once noted that the desire to be important is the deepest urge in human nature. William James said, "The deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated." This desire to feel important is what differentiates humans from animals. It is the urge that has driven civilization itself. Philosophers have speculated on the rules of human relationships for thousands of years, and from all that speculation, only one precept has stood the test of time. It's not new, it's as old as history. Zoroaster taught it to his followers in Persia 2,500 years ago. Confucius preached it in China 24 centuries ago. Lao Tse, founder of Taoism, taught it to his disciples in the valley of the Han. Buddha preached it on the banks of the holy Ganges 5 centuries before Christ. The sacred books of Hinduism taught it over 1,000 years before that. Jesus preached it among the hills of Judea 19 centuries ago. His teaching can be summed up in one thought, probably the most important rule in the world: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You want approval from those you interact with. You want recognition of your worth. You want to feel that you are important in your world. You don't want insincere flattery, but you do crave sincere appreciation. You want your friends and colleagues to be, as Charles Schwab once said, hearty in their approbation and lavish in their praise. All of us want that. So let's obey the golden rule. Give to others what you would like others to give to you. How, when, and where? The answer is simple. All the time, everywhere. For example, David G. Smith of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, shared how he handled a delicate situation when asked to run the refreshment booth at a charity concert. The night of the concert, I arrived at the park and found 2 elderly ladies standing next to the refreshment stand, both in a very bad mood. Each thought she was in charge. While I stood there pondering what to do, a member of the sponsoring committee handed me a cash box and thanked me for taking over. She introduced Rose and Jane as my helpers, then quickly left. A great silence followed. Realizing that the cash box symbolized authority, I gave it to Rose, explaining that I might not be able to keep track of the money and would feel better if she handled it. I then suggested that Jane show the 2 teenagers assigned to refreshments how to operate the soda machine and asked her to be responsible for that part of the project. That evening went smoothly, with Rose happily counting money, Jane supervising the teenagers, and me enjoying the concert. You don't have to wait until you are ambassador to France or chairman of a lodge committee to use the philosophy of appreciation. It works almost every day. For instance, if a waitress brings us mashed potatoes when we've ordered French fries, we could say, "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I ordered French fries." She'll likely respond, "No trouble at all," and be happy to correct the mistake, simply because we've shown respect. Little courtesies like, "I'm sorry to trouble you. Would you be so kind as to? Would you mind?" and "Thank you" smooth out the grind of everyday life and are the hallmark of good manners. Let's take another example. Hall Caine, a blacksmith's son who became one of the wealthiest literary men of his time, loved sonnets and ballads. He admired the poetry of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and wrote a lecture praising Rossetti's work, sending it to the poet himself. Rossetti was delighted and invited Caine to be his secretary in London, a turning point in Caine's life that introduced him to the literary world. Caine's career took off, and he became famous and wealthy. Who knows if he would have achieved such success had he not expressed admiration for Rossetti's work. Sincere appreciation has immense power. People crave recognition, and the simple act of making them feel important can change their lives. One of our instructors, Ronald J. Rowland, teaches arts and crafts in California. He told us about Chris, a shy, quiet student in his class who lacked self-confidence. Rowland invited Chris to join an advanced class, which was a privilege. Chris's emotional response and newfound confidence showed the power of making someone feel important. Rowland now keeps a sign in his classroom that reads, "You are important," to remind him that every student deserves recognition. The truth is, almost everyone you meet feels superior to you in some way. Recognize their importance sincerely, and you'll win their hearts. As Emerson said, "Every man I meet is my superior in some way. In that, I learn of him." In the workplace, applying these principles can yield remarkable results. Let's consider a Connecticut attorney who visited his wife's elderly aunt. During their conversation, he expressed admiration for her old house and the beautiful treasures she had collected. Moved by his appreciation, the aunt offered to give him her cherished Packard car. Although he initially refused, her need for recognition and gratitude compelled her to insist. Another example comes from Donald M. McMahon, who was landscaping the estate of a famous attorney. McMahon complimented the attorney's dogs, leading to a long conversation, a tour of the attorney's kennel, and eventually, the gift of a valuable puppy. All because of a few sincere words of admiration. Even the great George Eastman of Kodak fame craved recognition. When James Adamson, a seating company executive, visited Eastman's office, he complimented the room's woodwork, sparking a long conversation that resulted in a $90,000 order and a lasting friendship. Eastman even invited Adamson to lunch at his home. Such is the power of sincere appreciation. As Disraeli, one of Britain's shrewdest rulers, once said, "Talk to people about themselves, and they will listen for hours." Principle 6. Make the other person feel important, and do it sincerely. You can't win an argument. Shortly after World War I ended, I learned an invaluable lesson one evening in London. At the time, I was the manager for Sir Ross Smith, an Australian ace who had gained recognition in Palestine during the war. After peace was declared, Sir Ross astonished the world by flying halfway around the globe in just 30 days, a feat that had never been attempted before. His daring achievement created a tremendous sensation. The Australian government awarded him $50,000, and the King of England knighted him. For a time, he became one of the most talked-about men under the Union Jack. I attended a banquet one evening in Sir Ross's honor, and during the dinner, the man sitting next to me shared a humorous story. His story hinged on the famous quotation, "There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." He confidently attributed this quote to the Bible. However, I knew with absolute certainty that he was wrong. That quotation was from Shakespeare, not the Bible. Wanting to assert my knowledge and display superiority, I appointed myself as an unsolicited and unwanted committee of one to correct him. He stood his ground, insisting, "Shakespeare? Impossible! That quotation is from the Bible, and I'm sure of it." The storyteller was seated on my right, while on my left was my old friend Frank Gammond, who had spent years studying Shakespeare. So, the storyteller and I agreed to submit the question to Mr. Gammond for a final verdict. To my surprise, Mr. Gammond kicked me under the table and said, "Dale, you're wrong. The gentleman is right. That quote is from the Bible." Later that night, on our way home, I asked Mr. Gammond, "Frank, you knew that quotation was from Shakespeare, didn't you?" "It's from Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 2. "Of course," he replied, "but we were at a festive occasion. Why make someone uncomfortable by proving them wrong? What would you gain from that? Is that going to make the man like you? He didn't ask for your correction, and there was no need to argue with him. Always avoid the acute angle." That moment taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. Not only had I made the storyteller uncomfortable, but I had also placed my friend in an awkward situation. How much better would it have been if I had avoided the argument altogether? It was a sorely needed lesson, as I had long been an inveterate arguer. During my youth, I argued with my brother over almost everything under the Milky Way. Later, I studied logic and argumentation in college, and even took part in debating contests. Talk about stubbornness. I had to be shown before I believed anything. Eventually, I taught debating and argumentation in New York, and at one point, I was even planning to write a book on the subject. Since then, I have listened to and participated in thousands of arguments. The result of all this experience has led me to one conclusion. There is only one way to get the best of an argument, and that is to avoid it. Avoid it as you would avoid rattlesnakes and earthquakes. 9 times out of 10, an argument ends with both sides more firmly convinced of their own correctness. You can't win an argument. If you lose, you lose. And if you win, you still lose, because the person you defeated will resent you. Why is that? Well, suppose you triumph over someone by proving them wrong. You may feel great, but how does the other person feel? You've made them feel inferior, hurt their pride, and caused resentment. As the saying goes, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Years ago, a man named Patrick J. O'Hare joined one of my classes. Pat had little formal education, but loved a good scrap. He had been a chauffeur before attempting to sell trucks, and he came to me because his sales efforts weren't successful. After a bit of questioning, I discovered why. Pat constantly argued and antagonized his prospects. If someone said something derogatory about the trucks he was selling, Pat would see red and argue with them. He would win arguments, but he wasn't closing any sales. Pat admitted to me, "I used to walk out of offices thinking, I really told that guy off, but I hadn't sold anything." My first task wasn't teaching Pat how to talk, but teaching him to avoid arguments. Over time, Pat became one of the top salesmen for the White Motor Company in New York. How did he do it? Here's his story in his own words. If I walk into a buyer's office now and he says, "What? A white truck? They're no good. I wouldn't take one if you gave it to me. I'm going to buy the Who's It truck," I say. The Who's It is a good truck. If you buy the Who's It, you'll never make a mistake. The Who's Its are made by a fine company and sold by good people. That response leaves the buyer speechless. There's no room for an argument. If he says the Who's It is the best truck, and I agree, he can't keep arguing. He has to stop. We then move on to talking about the positive points of the white truck. There was a time when a remark like that would have made me furious, and I would have argued against the Who's It. The more I argued, the more the buyer would defend the Who's It, and in the process, he would end up convincing himself to buy my competitor's truck. Looking back, I wonder how I ever sold anything when I spent so much time scrapping and arguing. Now, I keep my mouth shut, and it pays. As the wise Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you argue and rankle, you may win a victory, but it will be a hollow victory because you will never win the goodwill of your opponent." So ask yourself, which would you rather have, an academic victory or someone's goodwill? You can seldom have both. The Boston Transcript once printed this verse: "Here lies the body of William J., who died maintaining his right of way. He was right, dead right, as he sped along. But he's just as dead as if he were wrong." You may be right, absolutely right, as you speed along in your argument. But as far as changing someone's mind, you'll likely be just as ineffective as if you were wrong. Consider the story of Frederick S. Parsons, an income tax consultant. One day, he found himself arguing with a government tax inspector over an item of $9,000, which Mr. Parsons claimed was a bad debt and should not be taxed. The inspector was cold, arrogant, and insistent that the debt must be taxed. After an hour of fruitless arguing, Mr. Parsons decided to change tactics. He complimented the inspector on his difficult job and acknowledged that the inspector had more experience in tax matters than he did. That change in approach caused the inspector to soften. He began sharing stories of his work and even opened up about his children. In the end, the inspector reversed his stance and agreed to leave the tax return as filed. What had happened? The inspector had wanted to feel important, and once Mr. Parsons acknowledged that, the argument disappeared. The inspector became a friendly and understanding person. As Buddha wisely said, hatred is never ended by hatred, but by love. Similarly, a misunderstanding is never ended by an argument, but by diplomacy, tact, and an effort to see the other person's point of view. President Lincoln once scolded a young officer for engaging in a heated argument. He said, "No man who seeks to make the most of himself can afford to waste time on personal contention. Better to give your path to a dog than to be bitten by him in contesting for the right." In an article published in Bits and Pieces, several suggestions were offered on how to prevent disagreements from turning into arguments. Welcome disagreement. If there's a point you haven't considered, be grateful if it's brought to your attention. Disagreements can be opportunities for growth. Distrust your first instinctive reaction. Our first reaction in a disagreeable situation is often to be defensive. Be careful and calm, as your initial reaction might not be your best. Control your temper. You can gauge the size of a person by what makes them angry. Listen first. Give others the chance to speak and finish their thoughts. Don't resist, defend, or debate. This only builds walls instead of bridges. Look for areas of agreement. Once you've listened, focus on points where you agree before addressing differences. Admit errors where appropriate. Acknowledge your mistakes and apologize, which can disarm defensiveness. Promise to consider your opponent's ideas. Agree to think over their points carefully. This gives you time to reflect without rushing into disagreement. Thank your opponent sincerely for their interest. Those who take the time to disagree with you care enough to engage, so treat them as allies. Postpone action. Suggest taking time to think things over, allowing both sides to cool down and reconsider the situation. Opera tenor Jan Pierce, who had been married for nearly 50 years, once shared the secret of his long-lasting marriage. "My wife and I made a pact that we've kept throughout the years. When one of us yells, the other listens. When both yell, there's no communication, only noise and bad energy." Principle 1. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. A sure way of making enemies, and how to avoid it. When Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House, he confessed that if he could be right 75% of the time, he would reach the highest measure of his expectation. If that was the highest rating that one of the most distinguished men of the 20th century could hope to obtain, what about you and me? If you can be sure of being right only 55% of the time, you could go down to Wall Street and make $1 million a day. If you can't be sure of being right even 55% of the time, why should you tell other people they are wrong? You can tell people they are wrong not just with words, but also through a look, tone of voice, or gesture. And when you do, does it make them want to agree with you? Never. Because telling someone they are wrong directly attacks their intelligence, judgment, pride, and self-respect, making them want to fight back. You could present the most flawless logic, like Plato or Immanuel Kant, but that won't change their minds once you've hurt their feelings. Never start by saying, "I am going to prove so-and-so to you." That approach is harmful, as it's akin to saying, "I'm smarter than you, and I'm going to show you how wrong you are." Such an attitude provokes resistance, causing the listener to prepare for battle even before the conversation begins. Changing people's minds is difficult, even under the best circumstances. So why make it harder by using a confrontational approach? If you want to prove a point, do it subtly and tactfully, so that the other person doesn't feel you're imposing your opinion. This concept is well expressed by Alexander Pope. Men must be taught as if you taught them not, and things unknown proposed as things forgot. Similarly, Galileo observed over 300 years ago, "You cannot teach a man anything. You can only help him find it within himself." Lord Chesterfield once advised his son, "Be wiser than other people if you can, but do not tell them so." And Socrates, the great philosopher, famously said to his followers in Athens, "One thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing." If Socrates could take this approach, how can we be certain that we're always right? I've stopped telling people they are wrong, and I find that it pays off. If someone says something you think is wrong, or even something you know is wrong, isn't it better to say, "Well, I thought otherwise, but I may be wrong. I frequently am. Let's examine the facts." There's a kind of magic in this approach. When you say, "I may be wrong, let's look at the facts," it disarms the other person, making them more likely to listen and less likely to argue. One of our class members, Harold Reinke, a Dodge dealer from Billings, Montana, tried this method with customers. In the high-pressure automobile business, he was often hardened in dealing with customer complaints. This led to tense situations, lost business, and unpleasant interactions. He decided to change his approach, admitting, "Our dealership has made many mistakes, and I'm often ashamed. We may have erred in your case. Please tell me about it." This disarming strategy worked wonders. By the time customers had expressed their complaints, they were more reasonable in finding a solution. In fact, several customers thanked him for his understanding attitude, and 2 even brought in friends to buy new cars. In a highly competitive market, this respectful approach helped him gain an edge over the competition. Admitting that you may be wrong will never get you into trouble. In fact, it often inspires your opponent to be just as open-minded as you are. If you bluntly tell someone they're wrong, it usually backfires. Let me illustrate with a real-life example. A young attorney, Mr. S., once argued an important case before the U.S. Supreme Court. During the argument, one of the justices remarked, "The statute of limitations in admiralty law is 6 years, is it not?" Mr. S. looked at the justice and bluntly replied, "Your Honor, there is no statute of limitations in admiralty law." The courtroom fell silent, and the atmosphere grew cold. Mr. S. knew he was right, but his approach damaged the relationship. Though he presented his case effectively, he failed to persuade the justice, all because of his bluntness. Most people are not logical. We are often guided by biases, fears, and pride. And few people want to change their minds about their beliefs, be it their religion, their politics, or even their haircut. So, if you feel the need to tell someone they are wrong, read the following passage from James Harvey Robinson's The Mind in the Making before you do so. We sometimes find ourselves changing our minds without any resistance or heavy emotion, but if we are told we are wrong, we resent the imputation and harden our hearts. We are incredibly heedless in the formation of our beliefs, but find ourselves filled with an illicit passion for them when anyone proposes to rob us of their companionship. It is obviously not the ideas themselves that are dear to us, but our self-esteem, which is threatened. Carl Rogers, the famous psychologist, wrote in his book On Becoming a Person that understanding others without judgment is an invaluable skill. When someone shares their thoughts, our natural instinct is to evaluate and judge them, rather than trying to understand their point of view. However, when we make an effort to genuinely understand others, it leads to deeper connections and more productive discussions. I once hired an interior decorator to make some draperies for my home. When the bill arrived, I was shocked by the price. A few days later, a friend commented on the draperies and exclaimed, "That's outrageous! He definitely overcharged you." Though she was right, I instinctively defended my decision, justifying the expense. However, when another friend admired the draperies and wished she could afford something similar, I admitted, "I paid too much." and I regret ordering them. The way a truth is delivered makes all the difference in how we react to it. When people are wrong, they may admit it to themselves or even to others, but only if they are approached gently and tactfully. Horace Greeley, one of America's most famous editors, disagreed fiercely with Abraham Lincoln's policies. He launched a relentless campaign of criticism against the president. However, his ridicule and attacks never persuaded Lincoln to change his mind. Hostile approaches rarely win over opponents. If you want to learn how to avoid arguments and improve your personality, read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Franklin, one of the most diplomatic men in American history, learned this lesson early in life. As a young man, he had a reputation for being argumentative. An old Quaker friend pointed out his flaw, saying, "Your opinions are so offensive that no one enjoys your company." Franklin realized the truth of this criticism and resolved to change. From then on, Franklin adopted a more modest way of presenting his opinions. He stopped contradicting others directly and instead used phrases like, "I conceive," or "it seems to me." This new approach earned him respect, helped him avoid arguments, and allowed him to prevail in discussions more often. How do these techniques work in business? Catherine A. Allred, an industrial engineering supervisor at a yarn processing plant, shared her experience. She had developed a new system to pay operators fairly, but when she presented it to management by telling them they were wrong, they rejected her proposal. After learning from her mistake, she tried a different approach, asking management for their thoughts and guiding them towards her solution. This time, her system was enthusiastically accepted. Similarly, R.V. Crowley, a lumber salesman, learned to abandon arguments after years of telling inspectors they were wrong. By asking questions and showing respect for their opinions, he saved his company money and preserved goodwill. The great civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., once said he judged people by their own principles, not his own. Likewise, General Robert E. Lee praised an officer who had been his bitter enemy, focusing on his merits rather than their personal differences. These examples show the power of diplomacy and respect. As Jesus said, "Agree with thine adversary quickly." And King Aktoi of Egypt, 2,200 years before Christ, advised his son, "Be diplomatic. It will help you gain your point." In other words, don't argue with others. Show respect for their opinions, and you'll win them over more easily. Principle 2. Show respect for others' opinions. Never say, "You're wrong,"